Okay, the last study we're going to discuss is called the VA Cooperative Study. It began in 1979, and there were a number of reports subsequent to that. One of the biggest problems in doing any kind of efficacy study, as we've already mentioned, is how do you have a control group? How do you tell patients that you're not going to get therapy? Well, the answer is you don't. You can't do that. It's just not feasible. It's not ethical. It's not moral, and it's not legal. And second is, how do you get enough patients? I mean, nobody's got enough patients to do that. So Basso did that because she had this wide region, geographic region, and she did it over quite a number of years. Well, in America, in the VA system, a whole bunch of different speech pathologists who represented different VA hospitals, medical centers throughout the country, and from California to the East Coast, and north and south, but like 20 of them got together and said, you know what, we could do this if we pool all our data. So I may only have 4 or 5 patients, and you may have 3, and you may have 7. But if we do exactly the same things with all of our patients, then we can legitimately pool all of our data together, and then we'll have a big group. And so that was a way of dealing with having enough patients. What about the control group? Well, there's no way in the world they're going to have that, or patients who aren't going to get therapy. So what they did is the following. First of all, they agreed on protocols. Patient selection was extremely rigid. All patients had to be X, Y, and Z. They had to be between that age and this age. They had to be right-handed. They had to have education no more than this and no less than that. There are aphasia scores on the PICA, and you would think that they would use the PICA because it's the most reliable instrument out there. So a person giving the PICA in Washington would get exactly the same score as a person in San Francisco if they were giving it to the same patient or to an identical patient. And so the PICA was the score. So all PICA scores had to be no higher than 80, no lower than 20 on the initial score, things of that nature, so that they were really working with identical patients. All patients had to be evaluated and start therapy on day 1 of the 2nd month post-onset. So if the stroke occurred on the 15th of May, patients had to be evaluated and start therapy on the 15th of June. And then they would be in the program for 11 months. So they would complete it on the 15th of May on the following year. Okay, so it was a 1-year study. The first month was basically for neurological stability and physical recovery, and then they were involved in the study for 11th month. If, in fact, a patient only got up until the 7th month and then had a sudden stroke or needed to move away or something, well, then they had to be thrown out. They weren't part of the study. It was very, very rigid. The controls were very tight. Okay. So what did happen? Well, patients would get selected randomly to start having individual therapy, and the type of therapy was very regimented as well, or they would start to have group therapy. And what went on in the group was also regimented. In other words, group therapy in San Francisco was the same as group therapy in Minnesota, but it was never focused as the same way as individual therapy on an individual because it was a group. So it was a lot of stimulation, but not focused therapy. Right? Now, patients didn't have that forever. What they would do was alternate. So let's say patient A in San Francisco, in his first month, had individual therapy. Patient B in Minnesota had group therapy. In the 2nd month, patient A in San Francisco might have group therapy. Patient B in Minnesota might have individual therapy now. And then sometimes it kind of leapfrogs. So you might have 2 months of individual and then 2 months of group and stuff like that. But it was all over the long haul. Everybody wound up having half of their therapy being individual and half of it being group. And all the data was pooled. Okay. What did they find? Well, what they found was that during the periods of time. Oh, and by the way, at the end of every month, they were given a new pica. And so data existed for every single person for every single month to show how much benefit was being generalized to language and abilities. And so the first and most important finding was that during the months of individual therapy, patients made more progress than they did during months where they were involved in group therapy. But that is not to say that they did not make progress during the months where they were involved in group therapy. They did, but not to the same degree as the months of individual therapy. If you think back, that's really exactly what Hagen found in his study, but his study was much smaller and not as well controlled. Okay, and so that became a very, very important finding towards efficacy, that all kinds of aphasia therapy actually is helpful, but the most helpful format of therapy is individual plan therapy that is focused on an individual and their deficits. A finding that they did not anticipate, they did not have a hypothesis about, but they found, was that, why was it that the therapy was designed to last 1 year? Even that was thought by many to be optimistic, that did they really think they would find so many changes in the second half of the year, and certainly at 9 months and 10 months and 11 months and 12 months? Come on, people kind of plateau. Remember, we had that whole discussion that really most of the changes will take place in the first 6 months, and then it'll be much slower in the second 6. So why waste all that time? Well, they did it. And what they found is that even at the end of 12 months, as a group, patients were not finishing making progress. Okay, they were still improving. And in fact, although they were no longer part of the study and it wasn't being funded, but they were in the VA hospitals, they continued to have therapy. There's no data on how much longer they stayed and how much more therapy was helpful. But in fact, that was a totally unexpected finding, but certainly gave thought to the whole issue of how long does a person make progress. And I think what the conclusion that was drawn was that, you know what, if patients are carefully selected, and they were from the beginning, we had no global patients, we had no very, very mild patients. You had lots of kind of middle-of-the-road patients, and there were clean patients in that they didn't have multiple strokes, and they didn't have lots of other neurological issues or vascular issues and stuff like that. And you really do lots of good therapy, they're going to keep on making progress for quite a while. And so one should never set a calendar and say, well, we're going to do X amount of therapy because that's how long people improve. You really have to just keep on going at it until they actually demonstrate that they're not going to improve any longer. Okay, so now we've kind of answered the efficacy, and frankly, in terms of the world and large, and the medical world and the actuaries and so on, nobody really questions the efficacy of aphasia therapy. They may question your efficacy, but that's your problem. You have to always be on your guard and make sure that that's why you have to have your documentation, you have to have your data to show that what you're doing really is effective. Okay, and that's it, guys. I thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure.